What is going on, everybody? It is your host, Redbeard, and welcome to the Sentinels of Liberty podcast. Thank you for coming in to the show tonight, and we are going to talk about a kind of a few issues that I think are pretty relevant or worth at least going over and having a conversation of. This is going to be a slightly different perhaps a slightly different episode, but we are going to focus a little bit more on society, the domestic side, and a few other outlying things that I feel I haven't touched on quite a bit in recent times. I've done a lot of the Founders Warnings things. I've done a lot of things regarding war and foreign policy and all of those things. But I figured that doing a slight pivot was going to be a good change of pace to focus a little bit more introspectively and kind of evaluate where things are eventually going to go, and kind of give us, kind of a glimpse in terms of where we're at and as a society, and how that affects how we further ourselves and how we can go about making different changes or affecting anything in the least. So without further ado, let's kind of jump into it. But before I get super far, there was a post by Rand Paul, which is that just popped up recently, showing Thomas Massey's debt clock, which is we have just crested $38 trillion in debt. So congratulations. We are $38 trillion in debt as a country. So there is that. We are still the beacon of success. Crazy to think about, really. It's genuinely crazy. But all that being said, I want to start a discussion here, kind of going over a little bit of societal things. And some of this was based off of an interaction that I actually had this week at work with an individual where some of the people from our company were working, and I had to drop something off, and I had an interaction with an individual at that particular job site, and they were fairly, they weren't super old, but they were definitely, 70s, maybe 80s. And, and she came up to me. She was super nice, very nice gal. And she, she's like, oh, like I always found, like trades and stuff like that to be very interesting. I find this work very interesting. And then it somehow like spun from this conversation where it was talking about, like what we were doing was interesting to immediately, it's like without missing a beat, just like, don't ever vote Republican. You can't trust Republicans. You have to vote Democrat, and you have to do this and you have to do that. And she just really, really hated Republicans for whatever reason. And it was just crazy. Right. And, I was having this conversation. I just, I nodded and I said, just kind of going along with the conversation and sharing a few tidbits here and there. And, ultimately I just ended up looking at her and I was just like, well, to be honest with you, I don't really like either Democrats or Republicans. They just don't do it for me, and I didn't really get too much more into the semantics of things. But, we talked about unions. We talked about, she, one of the things that, she had brought up was, healthcare, and, every real country has national healthcare. And she just really was on this tear of this idea of what it is that, she thought was like just this perfect thing. Quick shout out. David, great to see you. Chuck, great to have you in the house. Really appreciate you both being here tonight. But at any rate, she was on like this tear. And, after I left that interaction, I kind of thought to myself, I said, wow, like it's amazing because so many people have this idea that it's really like a bunch of these young people that are just so like tunnel visioned, and they're so like caught up, and they're so, radical and all of these different things. But after my interaction, with this individual, this lady, and really listening to her, not getting into an argument, not starting a massive debate, just having some back and forth. And I didn't really get too much into it, but um, you know, it's not just an issue with like young people, and I'll explain this in a minute. I think what you tend to see is when you look at some of these older people, they grew up in a time in which everybody around them, for the most part, either voted Republican or Democrat. Their house voted one way or the other. Their friends voted one way or the other. Their work voted one way or the other. Everybody that they knew was either Republican or Democrat, and whoever voted which way is typically the way that they went. They didn't. There wasn't really, if we're being honest, there wasn't really this situation to where, like, I don't know, this Republican might actually be halfway decent, or this Democrat might actually be halfway decent. There really wasn't any of that. Like, a household that stayed together was a household essentially that kind of voted together back in the day. And the same thing went for work, the same thing, people, you can say anything you want about people, not talking about voting or not talking about who they support in the polls. But in the end of the day, when you look at the older generation, you realize how systematic and how cemented it really was in their minds in terms of how stuck on these positions that they are. And when I listened to this lady, I realized that, my gosh, I mean, you have a situation where these people were so ingrained to vote one way, as if their entire life depended on it, their entire livelihood, their entire future, or whatever the case is, it depended their entire life on how they voted. And you have to imagine, if you will, just put yourself in their shoes, that over the course of so many years, all the people that they've gotten to know, all the people that they've met, all the people that they've made friends with and remained, family member with, et cetera, was all in line. It's almost like they developed their entire life around who they voted for, what party they supported, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that really is one of the biggest problems that we have today. But I want to explain it a little bit more, especially with the older folk, is there is a situation to where some of these old people, I don't know that they necessarily actually believe some of the things that they say. And I don't necessarily believe that many of them actually support the parties that they say that they support. That's not to say that many of them don't, right? But you do see this ingrained disposition that seems to predominate everything it is that they do. And I have met some old timers that are just staunch Democrats ever since they were 2 years old, right? I know that's an exaggeration, but literally that's the house they grew up in. They grew up in a union house, so they were Democrat their entire life. Their dad was a union guy. Their dad was a Democrat. Their mom was a Democrat. Their aunts, uncles, siblings, entire family were Democrats. And so that's what they've been their entire life. And that's what all their friends were. And it's the same thing with Republicans, right? You get these people that are in their 70s and their 80s and their 90s, and that's all they've ever known. And I thought about that. The more and more I actually thought about that interaction, just how not even intense, but just how stuck in that position that this lady was. Again, she was a very nice lady. And I couldn't help it. It's almost like, and you see this with regular people, it's like when you develop your entire life around a party, when you develop your entire life around this cult-like personality, I can't even imagine how hard it must be for some of these people to actually have a difference of opinion and have nobody to talk to about it, to have nobody to even put out a difference of opinion or a different thought or to engage or whatever the case is. And the realm in which, when that's all you've known is Democrat or Republican or whatever the case is, it's not necessarily those two, but those two typically predominate. How, terrifying it must be to some degree, right? Knowing that if you say something that's not in line with your party, that everything that you've ever known may potentially crash down around you, abandon you, isolate you, walk away from you because you are so ingrained and so stuck on supporting a party for 60, 70 years, right? And so the fear is what keeps you there, right? The fear of abandonment, the fear of not having anybody else to talk to, the fear of dying alone because you one day woke up and you decided that, you can't do this, you can't have this opinion, whatever the case is, because you'll have no one to talk to. And if you do, and that's the choice that you make, then you will go through potentially the rest of your life. That's how some of these people feel. I really do believe this, of just being perpetually alone. And it's so, I bring this up because I want people to fundamentally understand that, like, this is very predominant in older people. It absolutely is. I've spoken to so many older generations of people, and this is the mentality they have, whether they realize it or not. And that's not a knock against these people, right? I've known very, very nice people in their older ages, and some of them are very smart. Some of them are very nice, and they're kind and they're courteous. But in the end of the day, if you say something that goes against the party that they support, it's almost as if one of the most existential mechanisms of fear has all of a sudden been struck. And now they have to go on the defensive because I genuinely feel like some of these people feel like they're being watched. And if they don't say the right thing, if they don't toe that party line, then somebody's going to see that. They're going to say something, and they're going to be like, oh, Jan, who's like 75, Jan didn't say no to the libertarian guy, right? And because Jan didn't say no to the libertarian guy and then, explain the Democratic side or the Republican side, then all of a sudden, like, Jan's a traitor to the cause. And unfortunately, what we've seen today, right? What we have seen today is this isn't just a mentality that pertains even to like older people, right? To where they're at risk of alienating themselves and their families and all of that. We see this even in general society today, to where people are so invested, they're so hooked into these parties, and the fact that you could have a certain set of principles, you could have a certain set of morals, you could have a certain set of virtues, and all of these different things have to be set aside because it doesn't align with the party, even if that's something that you fundamentally believe, right? If you don't set aside your morals, your virtues, your principles, all of these different things, and you don't toe that party line, we've seen this today, even in contemporary society, not just with the older folk. I genuinely feel worse for the older folks because they have built an entire life around this, like decades upon decades upon decades of having to nod yes in agreement. And if they don't do it, like back in the day, like, you think things are bad. Like, there are people back in the day that, like, oh my gosh, if you worked at the union, but you didn't say what the union wanted you to say, you would have been ostracized, right? Like, you would have been excommunicado, right? You better believe that if you're not towing that party line, that wouldn't affect you somehow, right? And when you look at some of these older folks, it's like, I understand. I empathize with them, and I understand why it is that they're so staunch in some of the ways, because that's all they've ever known. That's all they've ever known. And then you have a class of individuals today that want nothing to do with them. They don't want to engage with them. They don't want to take the time to talk to them. They don't want to sit down and have conversations with them. And so that's all they know. And when you don't show them that there are other people out there that are willing to talk to them, communicate with them, whatever the case is. And look, I'm not saying that there aren't some people that they'll just never get it. There's always people like that, regardless of the generation. But my point is this is where these older people are. And we still see this today. This is one of the worst byproducts of the parties that we have in this country, is you have this undying loyalty. Well, not undying, like, you literally have people that will die for their loyalty for a party, and alienate themselves and push everybody away because of their fanaticism, but they're also equally afraid of, if they don't toe the party line, that they're going to be alienated, pushed away, isolated, whatever the case is. So it's kind of like you're stuck in this situation where you can't win. And so there's more of a fear of pushing people away and speaking out against something that you don't necessarily agree with than there is being alienated because, you're just unquestionably supporting a party, because you know that in that party, for the most part, you're still going to find people that you kind of agree with, right? And it's very sad. And I think especially in today's age, there is an overwhelming want and desire to not want to have to deal with people from a party, whether it's a Republican, a Democrat, a Libertarian, whatever the case is. And what I'm here to tell you is, like, look, parties are something that exists. Our founders fundamentally understood this. They knew that parties were inevitable, but what they didn't want is for people to make their entire life about the party. They didn't want people to make their entire life, or the way that they vote, or the way that they go about things, entirely invested into the party. Parties were good for bringing people together, but in the end of the day, they were, bound to lead to so many other issues and create factionalism and tribalism and all these other things. And ultimately, I think it's left us very destitute as a society with how that parties have ended up. And when I came away that the other day after having listened to this lady, like, to some degree, again, like, I felt terrible. My heart kind of broke, because it's like, this lady, like, this is all she's ever known. And, this bitterness or this anger or whatever towards Republicans, I really do feel like if you go back and you looked at her history, every single person that she's ever known has been a Democrat. Every single person she's ever talked to has been a Democrat. And that is not uncommon for these older generations. And it's still very common to the contemporary generations. And so I do see this as a fundamental societal issue, to where we have to do better, not only in reaching across and engaging people and being some people you're just not going to reach, some people you just can't engage, but that does not mean that we should not attempt to try. It does not mean that we can't express different ideas. We can't bring up, different ways of thought and be able to provoke these conversations. We have to be able to do this. And, otherwise, we're just going to continue this cycle of people that, ultimately are just going to be stuck in this tunnel. And when you craft, again, your entire life around this situation, I can't even imagine. I was stuck in a situation for a very long time, to where I thought, being a Republican was the only way of life. And then after, just near the end and getting out of high school, I eventually turned more towards like Ron Paul, and I looked into libertarianism, and I started really fundamentally investing myself into liberty and the Constitution and so many other things. And it really opened my mind to not only the idea, but the reality that there is life beyond the party. There is life beyond so many of these things. And while I do predominantly identify as a Ron Paul libertarian, that doesn't make who I am. It doesn't necessarily define every characteristic of my life. It doesn't mean that I have to only engage with libertarians. I can talk to anybody. And I think when you lose that, and when you lose yourself in this pandemonium, it can make life very, very sad. It can make life very disdainful. Like, you have disdain, and you become angry, and you feel alone and isolated. And so I just thought that was an interesting point to start on, because look, I mean, that it was just one of those key points to where I was just kind of in awe that like, it was so strong. And we do see this with the younger generations. I do think, however, that you're starting to see more people pull away from that, which I'm so happy to see. And I do think that you're starting to see more and more of a gravitation towards people, gravitating towards principles, virtues, morals, and stuff like that. And we've seen this in the shift in not only politics, but in faith and so many other things. And so I do think that there is hope, and I think that things are changing, at least from what I've seen and from so many different people that I've interacted with. So there is hope. And I really, really do feel that hope is key. And one of my favorite quotes in the world is by Dostoevsky, which is, to live without hope is to cease to live. And I do think that it is a core component. And sometimes you have to look a little bit harder. Sometimes you have to create your own hope. But in the end of the day, it's fundamental to continuing to move forward. When moving beyond that, when we look at society and we look at the way that society generally interacts with each other, and I'm just going to slightly touch and expound a bit more on this tribalism and this factionalism, right? So we had this situation, with this older gal, and but when you really broaden that up and you look at what the parties have done, and you look at this tribalism, you look at all of these different things, I think one of the best contemporary examples ever is really what is taking place with Thomas Massie and Rand Paul. And the reason that I say that is because you have a situation, right, where you have all of these Republicans that are just like, now we got to get rid of Massie, we got to get rid of Rand Paul, we got to primary these guys. They're not MAGA, they're not America First. And what I think is really astounding is when you look at all of the people who rally against Thomas Massie, when you look at all the people that rally against Rand Paul, and you look at all of these things that they criticize these two men of, right, is like, oh, like they just need to fall in line. They just need to do the thing for the Republican ticket, and they just have to do this. But yet this is the same party that also espouses and regurgitates and vomits this idea of constitutionalism and rights and liberty and blah, 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 blah. And what I really have kind of felt in after analyzing this for so many different weeks now is I think what they see when they look at Rand Paul and Thomas Massie and maybe one or two or maybe a handful of other people is I do think that there is this sense of this vile disdain or this resentment towards these people, because in the end of the day, what they see is like an action, or what they see as this situation to where, like, oh, they always vote no, they never do anything, they just sit there, they abstain, or they do whatever. And the arguments that Massie and Rand typically put out is like, look, like if it's not authorized in the Constitution, we don't do it. We do not fundamentally support it. We don't do this. It does not support liberty. It does not support rights. It does not support the things that the founders had laid before us, put into the Constitution, and enshrined in the Bill of Rights, right? And you have these people that rail against Massie and Rand Paul for sticking to these positions. And I think that there's just a disdain and a resentment by some of these people, really, I do. And the fact that these two men are far more principled and far more exceedingly willing to put everything on the line to stand up for their principles, their virtues, and their morals than they are. And I think that there's a resentment about the fact that these individuals who criticize them are so easily bought and sold to the highest bidder. And I think that bothers a lot of people. And when you look at some of now look, I get how people could take that, perhaps it's reaching, but look, I'm just saying this as like, this is a potentiality, right? This really is a potentiality, because we have a Congress that is so bankrupt of morals, of virtues, of principles altogether, that it really does kind of make sense when you really think about it and you take the time to go through and look at all of these actions. These really, they are the two guys that fundamentally say no and stick by what they believe. And when you look at so much more of Congress, and you look at the way that Congress conducts itself, and you look at how many people are bought and paid for that roll over for any little thing that comes down the road, it is amazing. And especially when you look at the people that they want to replace both Paul and Massie with, some of the most despised people by Americans to ever exist. One of them got unwavering support, is fully supported by President Trump, right? Which is Lindsey Graham. President Trump backed Lindsey Graham. President Trump, backs a person like Lindsey Graham, one of the most detested and disgusting people I could ever imagine being in Congress. And this is the person that you want to start replacing, a person like Massey or Paul with, right? Like that's the choice over two guys like Massey or Paul, right? Like, and I think the guy that is put forth to run against Massey, if I remember correctly, he's a Navy SEAL or whatever the case is, and but he's a Lindsey Graham donor. They literally picked the Lindsey Graham donor to run against Thomas Massey. I'd be shocked if he even gets a remote amount of the votes. The guy's got no shot. He lost horribly in the rankings the last time I think he went up against Massey. There's no shot, right? But these are the individuals they want to replace Massey with, are these these neocons and these people that just want endless wars. They want your tax dollars to be shipped over to places like Ukraine and Israel to fundamentally provide subsidies to all these countries that talk about how strong and powerful they are, but they can't even stand on their own 2 feet without American support, and so many other things. These are the gentlemen they want to replace Rand Paul and Thomas Massey with. And when you look at the vitriol as it pertains to this party allegiance, and you have these same people in these parties, especially the Republican Party, who overwhelmingly, again, always talks about the Constitution and liberty and blah, 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 blah. Well, for people that talk about it all the time, they really suck on the issues. They really suck on actually adhering to the Constitution and, being good stewards of the country and the Constitution, the founding documents, liberty and rights. And, but yet they won't at all ever shudder about trying to sell out the American people and replace people who genuinely are trying to work towards a more constitutional, limited governance style republic as it was intended. But they'll replace them with somebody like Graham or this other guy, who's so insignificant I can't even remember the guy's name. Everybody else remembers the name. I don't remember the guy's name, and probably for good reason. But you see this vitriol, and any time that they're not talking about, who's going to replace Massey or Paul or whatever, there's always this perpetual fighting of the left versus the right, and this, you have to hate these people because we tell you, and you have to hate these people because we tell you. And I think realistically, if more people stepped away from their parties and they spent more time outside and they actually went into their neighborhoods and they got to know their neighbors, and look, you're going to have differences. And I think the reality of it is we have created a society that is so afraid of people having a difference of opinion, people so afraid of their neighbor not conforming to the political ideology or the party that it is that they profess to have, that you've created a society that just hates each other all the time. They detest anybody that doesn't think the same way as them. And this is not the fundamental foundation, if you will, that the founders had intended. This is exactly why you had people like Washington and several others that were ardently opposed to the idea of parties to begin with. And that's not to say that some of our founding fathers didn't entrap themselves in a party, because it very well did happen. But the point being is their warnings still hold water. They still hold weight. And they fundamentally understood that these things would become a bane of liberty should we fall in this trap. And as such, you have this disintegration of society. And, when you create such a paranoia and such a hypochondriac response, amongst your neighbors and people within your city or your town or whatever the case is, your state, to the point to where, you have just shut yourself out from being able to deal with people like a normal, rational human being. It really creates this instability to where not only is there no way for liberty to grow, but you're always going to see the expansion of government. And government is always going to come in. They're always going to say that we see a problem, most of which they create, and we have the solution, of which they also create, right? And so they have this thing to where you have these sides that promise you one thing or the other. And ultimately, when these people get elected, they forsake the people that voted for them. They throw them under the bus. They ask you for more for more tithes and taxes, and they will take everything it is that you are taxed, and they will send it overseas, send it to something else, and really you get nothing in return for it, right? And so you fall into this cyclonic trap of what this party system is, this idea of being provided, all of these hopes and dreams and promises by all these people that are nothing more than hustlers, hucksters, thieves, robber barons, murderers, and so on and so forth. And this brings me to one of my other points that I really feel needs to be driven home as a segue, right? This is the same government that also goes fanatically looking abroad, trying to find a new enemy to justify the warfare state. And I know that I said that I was going to stay a little bit away from this, but I just want to touch on this briefly. When you look at what the warfare state produces, it produces more taxation, it produces more control, it produces a loss of liberty, it produces a restriction upon rights, it produces more compliance and less free thought. It produces a situation in which the government grows, but yet the liberty of the people tends to shrink. And so when you look at the overall dynamic that occurs here, right, it becomes very, very trepidatious. This government goes forth, seeks enemies abroad. Oftentimes, whatever it doesn't find abroad, it will label the average American as being an enemy, and they will arbitrarily just come up and detain or hold people for as long as they want, without due process, with no trial, with no nothing. And we've seen this in numerous cases. And ultimately, what the founders had predicted is something that has occurred several times in the United States, in which the implements of warfare abroad used against our enemies ultimately come back home to roost to be used against the yous and me's. Hence things like, the Patriot Act and the NDAA and so many other implementations of spying, the usurpation of privacy and liberty and rights. And, you have organizations like the TSA, you have organizations that have only expanded in power and things like the ATF, right? And you have so much more that has come from these tools and from these usurpations that it ultimately undermines the very fabric of what it is to be an American. And I do think that in large part, when you look at so many of these other issues, the overwhelming control of the education system, the ability to control the narrative, the ability to go forth and to dictate what it is that is being taught in schools. Now I fundamentally understand where people are going to interject and they're going to say, but they can't dictate. They can't set the curriculum. This is the things that the public schools do. Aha. But here's the thing though. The way that they do implement their curriculum, the way that they do hijack the education system is, yes, well, they cannot directly do this per se. What they do is they offer grants, they offer funding, they offer subsidies to these public schools, to these colleges, to the universities, and say, if you don't implement or if you don't trial, not in those words particularly, but if you don't meet these parameters, is more or less how they put it, then you won't qualify for funding. And those parameters can include everything from the way that the history books or the type of history book, because they want to trial it and see how well it works, or things like DEI and so much more. If you don't adhere to these parameters and you don't go towards these things and you don't do the things that qualify you for these fundings, for these subsidies, for all of these investments and all of this money, then you're not going to get all of the benefits that the government has to give you. This is a huge reason why that a lot of people have pulled their children out of the public school system and into private schooling and or homeschooling, which is a huge reason why homeschooling has been overwhelmingly attacked. But I really do genuinely believe that after COVID, a lot of that tended to change, and you've seen a massive uptick in more students either being homeschooled or going into private schools. Now, where am I going with this? I'm going with this, right, is there is an education problem. There's more people now than ever that always talk about how our country was founded. And I know that some people don't necessarily like the semantics. They don't necessarily like being buried in, certain things as it pertains to terms or definitions or whatever the case is. But I do think it is very, very important to understand the type of country that we were founded as. We were founded as a constitutional republic. We are not a democracy. The democracy aspect of it was not mentioned. And more importantly, when it was mentioned outside of the Constitution, of course, naturally, it was seen as nothing more than a potential frightful despotism, of which democracies historically had always devolved into. The founders fundamentally understood this, and people before the founders fundamentally understood this. And so you have a situation to where everybody refers to the United States as a democracy, whereas instead we are a constitutional republic. A democracy, all that is required is 51% of the population to usurp, control, and trodden down the other 49% of the population, right? It is mob rule. The mob gets to be able to tell the government how it is that they're supposed to do their jobs. And in most cases, the government still could just run away and do their own thing. Whereas in a constitutional republic, the majority has no right to, they have no power to usurp the rights and liberties of even the smallest minority. The smallest minority, according to Ayn Rand, respectively, is the individual themselves. So therefore, the majority has no power to usurp, legislate, ask the government to be able to usurp or take away the rights, liberties, property, livelihood of another person, because they're not able to do that in a constitutional republic. Now, it's very important to fundamentally understand how to prevent the degradation of a constitutional republic. We can also go back to our founders for this. They understood that a well-educated, virtuous, moral people were the people that were expected to keep the republic, right? So when we look at domestic issues and we look at the, I guess, expected return of people assuming that we're a democracy versus a constitutional republic, i.e. the public school system and the incentives I'm sure there are as to changing that definition, we can look at the moral virtue and the degradation therein, right? The education, right? The degradation of all three of these things. And you look at the moral decline, you look at the decline in virtue, you look at the decline in education, what do you end up getting in return? Certainly not a constitutional republic, because you are deaf, dumb, and blind, right? So when you create a population that is deaf, dumb, and blind, they don't fundamentally understand what they have to lose, what they have to gain. You can hardly keep it, right? So therefore, you get to have the ability to change the verbiage. Instead of being a constitutional republic, you are now a democracy. And when you can get enough people to say that you are a democracy, that is widely what is believed. This is not necessarily willing ignorance, but is ignorance by implementation. I firmly believe that. So where does this all go? With education, with the decline of virtues, with the decline of morals, with the decline of so many other things, so many pieces that add up into our society. What you get is a population that can be convinced that the enemy is anywhere but your backyard. And I'm not talking about necessarily your own fellow American. What I'm talking about is the very people who sit there and dictate every single facet of your life, that tell you that you have to pay these taxes, otherwise we will send armed men to your door, and because you didn't allow us to rape what it is that you have. You're not allowing us to take your property. You're not allowing us to seize your car. You're not allowing us to take via force the money that you make, which, by the way, an income tax was not legal. It was not constitutional. It is not something that was ever supposed to be implemented, by the way. When you look at the idea of property, property is left solely to the individual. So if you do a comparison also of how people used to buy property way back when in the 1900s, and I would argue even in the 1800s, it was not the same way that it was done today. And as a matter of fact, if you defaulted on your property, it was between you and the bank, right? It was between you and the bank. There was no government intervention. There was no man coming to your door, essentially kicking your door in and saying, hey, you didn't pay this, so now we're going to come and take it, right? The bank usually had a way of dealing with something like that, but I digress. You have a situation in which you have this growing government apparatus, and they still perpetually are convincing you that the the enemy is in China. The enemy is in Russia. The enemy is anywhere but the United States. And if it is in the United States, well, it has to be Antifa. It has to be these people. It has to be that. And look, I'm not saying that some of these places may or may not have their own issues. And I'm not saying that some of these places may or may not cause their own problems, but likely also is all of the people that we are entangled in alliances with, right? So in the end of the day, if you also want to see where some of our problems lie, in that sense, you can't just simply outsource this to people that perhaps we don't have a good disposition with, but also the people that we have alliances with. Entangling alliances were rebuked and considered repugnant, yet we overwhelmingly throw money and more money to places like Israel, to places like Ukraine, to places like the EU and NATO and so many other places. And rarely do we ever actually get to see any real advancement as it pertains to us here in the United States. We are the people that matter. So all of these people that go against people like Thomas Massey and Rand Paul that say that, yo, you're not MAGA enough, are the same people that spout about America first, but then will outsource everything it is that you have and everything that you work for and all of the things that they say are supposed to stay here to everybody else except you. All while trying to convince you that there's some other greater enemy out there. And I would argue, and perhaps this is not a unique statement, but I still think it's a rather bold statement to some degree, to posit simply this. Of all of these things that I've just talked about, of all of these things, and I've really just skimmed over it. I have some other videos regarding the Founders' Warnings. If you want to know more about that, please go back and check out those videos. But what I will say is when you break it down, you have to step back and you have to look around and be like, wow, like, who's really depriving me of liberty? Who's depriving my rights? Who's depriving me of my hard-earned money, the things that I went to work and that I earned, the things that I worked my tail off for? Who's depriving me of the ability to feel safe and secure within my own home? Because again, if you're not paying the taxes, the property tax, right? If you're not paying for your tabs, if you're not paying for other things, who shows up at your door? It's the government, right? If you truly own your property, then why would the government come to your home and tell you to get out of your home because you didn't pay taxes on your home? See, this idea that when you finish your mortgage or you finish your payments or you buy off your car, it doesn't end there. There can be no freedom where your property is not truly yours. There can't be a real sense of liberty when your property is at stake. And your property includes yourself, right? If you cannot retain this, if you can't retain, your home, if you can't retain your vehicle, right? So they come and deprive that. They would tell you that you have to do this. This is a mandate, right? You have to get the vaccination. Look, don't take this the wrong way. People are free to make their own decisions. I don't care if somebody gets a vaccination or not. That's not my business. I will do what I'm going to do. You do whatever you want to do. But that's the thing, is like, we need to make those independent decisions. And we should not have the government be stepping in and telling us that we have to make a decision and heavily implying that if you don't make the right decision, that you'll be penalized for it, that you're a lesser individual for it. That is not a society that has liberty. That is not a government that is just in what they do. That is not a government that supports its people, right? And the founders fundamentally understood that government was but a necessary evil, but they tried to frame the best one that they possibly could. A more perfect union, not a perfect union, right? A more perfect union. And so when we look at all of these things, and I barely scratched the surface on this. Why is it that whenever somebody starts to bring up the enemies that the American people have, the enemies that are the most threatening to the American people, why is it that they're not the ones in our own backyard, in our capitals, in DC, in so many of these other places. These people that would go forth and deprive us of our very lives if they felt that it was necessary. And even more so, we are getting to a point to where you're restricted in some ways if you have business practices that they don't approve of. They love to label people terrorists, anti-Semites, or people that don't like one group of people or another. Look, you have the ability to do that. That is the uniqueness of the United States, is the fact that you don't have to agree with other people. You don't have to sit here and agree with somebody to your left or to your right. That is who we are as an American society. But now they're making it to a point to where if you say the wrong thing on the internet, if you say the wrong thing at work, if you do the wrong thing, well, we're going to punish you. We're going to take you to jail, or we're going to bring you to court, or we're going to do this, and we're going to ravage and wreck your life for the rest of your life so that you won't even know what normal is. We'll threaten your family, we'll threaten your friends, and we'll come after you in every dirty way that we possibly can, right? And yet we're supposed to believe that this government actually cares about the people. We're supposed to believe that this government is less of a threat to the average American than somebody that's thousands of miles away. Look, the founders warned us about this. The most immediate threat is always in our backyard. And this threat, this potential despotism, this tyranny, can always be persuaded away whenever you deprive the education, the values, the morals, and the virtues away from the people. When you make people a baseless and principleless society. That's why I don't think there's any mistake that these things go hand in hand. So when I look at society and when I look at the domestic side, we really do need to take a step back, and we need to analyze the things that are taking place. We really have to take a breather and go back and do some introspection and see where it is that we really lie. So I'm here to tell you, I've been through it. I've seen the other side. I was a rabid statist. Rabid. I remember in high school, I was so bad to the point to where I had no problem glassing the Middle East, right? Didn't even care. Didn't even care. And I've said this numerous times before. I had no problem. War, we'll take it to them. Nuke them all. If they don't agree with us, if they don't like this, then just be done with them, right? That's where I was. That was the mentality I had. I was so staunchly against anybody that didn't have my position that I was just, I probably would have been no fun at parties. I'm here to tell you that. Look, it's a hard way to live your life. And it's when you get away from that, right? When you get away from that mentality and you look back and you have the opportunity for introspection, you see where that brings you and you see how just dark it is. And then you realized how much you were influenced by so much of the propaganda. And look, propaganda goes both ways. You can have a positive form of propaganda, but you can also have a very nefarious form of propaganda. And I was stuck in it, man. I was stuck in it. I liked Bush. I liked all of those people. I thought the war in the Middle East was the greatest thing in the world. And then years later, I looked back and I was like, no, what am I doing? My goodness, how is it that I ended up so far astray? How is it that I ended up with such a mentality? And moreover, how did I break away from it? And it's not easy. So look, if you have people that are stuck in that position, just remember, you were there at one point, right? For those of you that see things a little bit clearer, that don't just walk away from people, that don't just disengage because they don't have your opinion or your viewpoint or whatever. And when I look at so many of the people I deal with in the American Liberty Caucus and in the Liberty circles in general, amazing people, and to those who are coming in, I would just tell you, and look, you can obviously make your own decisions, but Remember where you came from, and remember that it may or may not have been more of a struggle for you. Everybody has to start somewhere. And again, doesn't mean everybody will, right? Not everybody's going to see it differently. Not everybody's going to want to change. Not everybody. But when you find the people that have some potential, when you see the people that want to change, when you engage with somebody and you can kind of tell, you can kind of tell in their tone and in the way that they approach certain things, whether or not that they have questions, right? Don't push them away. Don't push them away. Engage with these people. That is one of the most fundamental things. And I'm here to tell you, if there was ever anything that I think terrifies the powers that be, if there's anything that terrifies the people in DC, the people in your own states, the people that want more and more power, they want more control, they want more all of this. They are terrified by simple discussion. They are terrified by the free exchange of ideas. They are terrified by the fact that people can get together that don't have the same opinions, that can share a barbecue and let their kids play together. That is radical to these people. That is insanely radical to these people. They hate that. They despise it because that doesn't factor into their ability to control you. Become the uncontrolled person, and you will see a change in your fellow man. Be the person that can be somebody that can be depended upon in your society, in your family, whatever the case is. Be the person that can reach across the aisle. Be the person that can have the conversations, because that is radical to the government. And they hate it because that very thing, they know that you can ferment change there. And that is one of the biggest powers that you and I both have. So societally, we have a lot of problems. We have a lot of problems. We have a lot of moral issues. We have a lot of issues of virtue. We have a lot of education issues. We have so many different things, but I do believe it all starts with one conversation, whether it's over a cup of coffee, sitting with someone on a park bench, whatever the case is. We have to go into these situations. And I'm not going to say that like sometimes you might not be afraid. You know, I'm sure you will, but we got to try. And I think that is one area where those in the liberty community that really believe in what it is that they're doing, I think that's the advantage we have over both the left, the right, and all of these other crazy sectors, is like we're people. And we want to remind people that you're people too, right? And that we can come together. We don't have to agree on everything, but we can work towards something better. So on that note, I'm going to leave you, I guess, kind of on that. I hope you guys and gals really got something out of this. Please let me know with comments down below. What did you think? Let me hear what your thoughts are. Leave it in the comment section, either here or afterwards, and just let me know some of the things that you feel, some of the things that you think, you know, trepidations, whatever the case is. Let me hear your stories. I want to hear stories of where people started and where they are in this journey, because we're all kind of on this journey of trying to better ourselves and better everything else. And so I think that's important. And look, the more people that we can get in the comment section, you know, you might find somebody in your backyard. We might find somebody that's a lot closer to us. And so if it's not me, you know, if there's somebody that's, you know, in Massachusetts and you're like, oh, there's somebody in Massachusetts, I could meet this person, whatever the case is, right? Like we need to connect with each other, and we need to be able to do that in order to make a difference. And so I highly, highly recommend it. Look, I'm not expecting miracles here, but we can be that difference. So take that for what you will. I hope you guys and gals enjoyed this. Until the next one, it's going to be Saturday, right? As per schedule, Saturday at 1700 Central Time. We'll be back on. We'll have another good show on Saturday. Feel free to stop by, join in on the conversation. Let me know your thoughts, your questions, concerns, whatever comments. And, you know, I love seeing everybody who shows up and everybody that participates. It really, really does mean a lot. Like, share, subscribe, send it to people you know. And you know, get the word out, get the message out, get the podcast out, and just show people what it is you've been listening to, whether you hate me, like me, whatever the case is, get it out there. And we will see you next Saturday, or this Saturday. So take care. God bless, and I will leave you guys and gals with a little bit of outro music.
Steel-clad fist, rise in the dark. Shattered chains, ignite the spark. Tyrants crumble, feel the flame. Settle strike, and freedom's name. March of vengeance, hearts of stone. Blades of justice carve the